Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Moms Who Know podcast, the podcast for moms who know that when they take care of themselves, they can take better care of everyone else. Today's podcast is an amazing story of a woman who has been through so many things. Just when you think you're listening to her story and think, well, surely that's it. Surely that's all that this poor woman has had to go through. And yet there's more and there's more and there's more. But she has been able to come through stronger and better, and because of what she's been through, to help other people. My guest is Sandra Jarvis. She is a life coach. She helps other women and can help them from such a place of strength because of all she has been through. So you are really going to enjoy this episode with Sandra Jarvis. Hello and welcome to the Moms Who Know podcast. I'm your host, Chanel Nielsen, and my guest today is Sandra Jarvis. Sandra, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I am excited to learn about your story. Sandra just came out with a book, and as I heard about the subject of her book and learned a little bit more about her story, I was really intrigued and just excited to learn more about you and about the things that you've been through and the things that you've learned on your journey. So let's just jump right in and start with kind of a little bit more about your growing up years and kind of some of the things that you went through.
Okay. So I was born into a home that had a lot of dysfunction. My father was bipolar. He was also homosexual and had kind of, this was, my parents married in the 50s and kind of married because that was going to fix his problem. And instead, it made him very frustrated and angry. And so I grew up with a lot of abuse, a lot of anger. The feelings that I remember was that I always wanted to escape from my home and always wanted to just get away from the turmoil that was constantly going on. And on top of that, there was some sexual abuse going on and a lot of confusion. We were a very religious family and very active in our church. And so going to church and hearing the things that we were being taught there, and then coming home to something that was completely different for me was just very confusing and caused a lot of feelings of self-doubt and some issues with my self-worth, and just really caused me to feel like I wasn't good enough. I was never good enough. There was nothing I could do to be good enough. And I kind of had this, as I got into my teenage years, I kind of came up with this theory, and I called it the big one. And I decided that God must be testing me and trying to use all of these experiences to see if I was strong enough to do whatever. I'm not even sure what I was proving, but in my mind, I was having to prove something about myself. And that someday I was going to have this trial, this challenge that was going to be so big that when I get through, it would finally prove my worth, and then all of my problems were going to end. So from the time I was probably 12, 13, that age, I started living my life waiting for the big one, just waiting for this big thing that was going to happen, that was going to prove my worth and make everything go away.
So not that all the things that you were already going through were the test, but they were the preparation for something even bigger?
Yeah, that was kind of how, I kind of felt like it was that I had been born into this. So the chaos was all I knew. And so with the chaos never ending, I felt like as I got older, things were getting more difficult, and I was going through even more difficult trials. It started with watching my mother be abused, and then I started being abused, and then I was being sexually abused, and it was just like they were getting bigger. And so in my mind, it was going to, I was getting progressively bigger trials and problems. And someday it was going to be so big that it was just going to end everything. And then I was going to have peace, which, saying that out loud sounds kind of crazy, but that's what I believed.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting theory, and it's interesting for me to just ponder that and sit with that for a second, because as kids, we're just trying to figure out our world, and you had a lot to figure out. Like, that is really rough. Now,
Right.
I can also, something that stands out to me is the whole idea of this confusion of what you were learning in your faith was different than what you were living at home.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you are still a member of your church.
Yes.
And how were you able to come to terms with that aspect, and to see faith as separate from what you learned in your family?
Well, I think that because of this theory that I had, I didn't. Well, I guess I should say this first. I have often said that I was born with a testimony of God, that for whatever reason, I never doubted the existence of God. And I never doubted that there was a purpose for the things that were going on. It was something that I just always knew. And so because of that, I didn't necessarily connect things to I didn't connect all of the trials to, I'm not even sure this is true, except that it's what is feeling right. I didn't really connect it to a negative thing necessarily. It was the way I was being proved, it was the way that I was going to prove myself. And so while there were a lot of challenges and a lot of questions about the things I was learning that were so different from what I was living, I felt like I just had to be better, and then everything would be okay. So I wasn't blaming my church. I was trying to be better in my church, and I was really good at it. I was going for perfection. So the older I got married, I started having children, and I had dreams of these children that were going to always be dressed in little white dresses and little white suits and run around on my white carpet and be perfect. I mean, isn't that how we're all going to have children?
Yes.
So it was like I was looking for perfection, and it didn't occur to me that I should quit having faith, because I just had to have more of it in order to get that perfection. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective, I think, and speaks to, your faithfulness, and that you believed that. And I think that's really cool. Now, when you got married, I don't think that all the problems went away and things got suddenly easy, and there were white carpets in your house, right? There were some challenges in your later years too, right?
Yes,
Tell us about
definitely.
that.
So I did get married very young, and I kind of thought that I was escaping my childhood when I got married. And instead, I got married, and it kind of within the first year or so, we started having some pretty major problems that were connected to my childhood abuse. As I said, I had been sexually abused as well, and I really struggled with intimacy in marriage, and that was a really hard thing for me. And so we had some big issues with that we worked to try and overcome together. But then a few years into our marriage, I discovered that my husband had a pornography addiction. And he had been introduced to pornography when he was about 6. So it had been pretty much a lifelong addiction. And as a survivor of sexual abuse, that was probably the most harmful thing that my husband could do. And that really put a huge wedge in our marriage. However, he assured me that he was never going to have that problem again. And I was just naive enough to believe that. And so, although it kind of put a wedge in our marriage, we went on and continued to try and make things work. We had 5 children in the first 10 years of our marriage. And so, there was a lot going on in the early years of our marriage. So it wasn't like I was sitting around doing nothing. For all the moms out there who have lots of little kids, whenever you're raising children, you are busy. And so I was busy, and I was, again, trying to be perfect. So I was busy serving in my church. I also was serving as the PTO president for my children's school, and I was teaching violin lessons, and I was doing all kinds of things. So I wasn't spending a lot of time really thinking about the problems in our marriage. And honestly, my problems were so big because of my childhood abuse that it was really easy for me, even though I knew my husband had an addiction, it was really easy for me to look at our marriage and look at the problems and blame it all on myself. So he told me about his addiction, and the other thing is with pornography addiction, that the spouses often do believe that it's their fault, because I already knew I wasn't enough. That was the message I had gotten out of my childhood. And so having my husband be addicted to pornography just kind of cemented it. And so it kind of just pushed me even more into that perfectionism of trying to just do more, be more, do everything I could possibly do to become perfect. Ultimately, so I could get to the big one, because that was still going to happen. I still believed that.
You still believe that at this point, even though I would have thought at this point, like, oh, this is it. This is the big trial. Like, you had been through so many things at this point.
Yeah. Well, and that was the thing, though, is that every time something came up in my life, I always thought, okay, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the big one. And I just have to make it through this. I just have to get through. And on the other side is going to be peace. And I literally lived my life through all of these trials, just thinking, okay, if I can get through this, then everything is going to be okay. So honestly, my theory probably saved me because it kept me going.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's kind of why I was asking about your faith earlier, is because, just this idea of you're still hanging on. You're still hanging on, like, well, God must be testing me. And you still believed in him. And I think it could be so easy to, like, well, if he's going to keep throwing stuff at me, just forget it.
Right.
I'm done, at a certain point, to just feel done. And yet, I think that's a good point. I mean, it kept you hanging on. It kept you, okay, I'm going to get through this, and there will be peace. Now, so, okay, rough start with your marriage. What else? What else in your family life?
So we, as I said, we had 5 children. I dealt with some really severe depression when after each one of my children was born, I had postpartum depression. But then after my fifth child was born, my daughter, the postpartum depression was much worse. And I since have been told that it was probably more like postpartum psychosis, which is where you don't want to have anything to do with your child. You feel very almost violent towards them, which was how I felt with her. I didn't want anything to do with her. And because I had been abused myself, I had made this promise to myself that I would never abuse my children. And because of that, when I would just get so frustrated and I couldn't deal with it anymore, I would just put her in her bed and walk away. And, she would cry until my husband got home or whatever. But I think that to some degree, my abuse saved her because I was very conscious of that. And so even though, putting her in her crib and letting her cry maybe wasn't the greatest mothering technique, it was something that for me in the state of mind that I was in, it was just how I could deal. And so when I think she was probably 6 months old when I woke up one day and just knew that everyone would be better off without me. And that day, if I could have taken my life without affecting my children, I would have done it. I was just that low, that depressed. And I had three young children at home. My two older ones were in school, but my younger ones were, like I said, about 6 months, and then 2 and 4. So I had 3 children at home, and I knew that if I did anything, they would be the ones to find me, and I couldn't do that to them. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up calling my husband and sobbing on the phone. I'm not even sure I said a word, but he got the message that something was terribly wrong and came home. And when he came home, he found me in bed with the kids all stuck in front of the TV, and he tried to figure out what was going on. And honestly, I was just sobbing and couldn't even really talk to him. But, he knew that I had been really struggling and assumed that, I had hit rock bottom, which I had. And so he came and into me. I was laying in my bed. I remember him coming in. He was carrying the baby. And he said, "You have to get help. You have to see a psychiatrist." And it made me really mad. I was like, my husband thinks I'm crazy and I just need to get away. In my mind, it was just, I just need to escape. And I said that to him, and he was like, "Oh no, you're not leaving. You are going to get help." And he finally said to me, "If you're not going to go get help, then I'm going to go to a psychiatrist because I can't live like this anymore." And that made me even more angry to think that he was going to go to a psychiatrist and talk about his crazy wife. So I finally agreed to go just because I didn't want him to be the one talking to the psychiatrist. So he found a psychiatrist, and I was in their office that afternoon. And the psychiatrist had me take a test, and I've never seen another psychiatrist with a test like this. And I've been to several, but this was a test that I had to answer 60 questions, and each question was 1 point. And I took the test, and then I went in and met with him. And he told me that the scores from 0 to 10 were normal. From 10 to, I think it was 10 to 20 was like mild depression. From 20 to 40 was kind of moderate depression that they needed to treat with medication. And then 40 to 60 was suicidal watch. And I was at 58. And he just said to me, you need help. And he said, if you're not willing to work with me now, because I was very resistant to being there, then he was going to admit me to a hospital. And that made me even more mad, because even though I was totally depressed, I was very angry and did not want to be there. So I agreed to work with him. And so I worked with him off and on. Well, I worked with him consistently for 2 years, and it took 2 years for us to figure out a medication combination that got rid of the depression. But he was determined. He told me there are hundreds of drugs on the market, and there is something out there that will help you. And he actually worked with me until he got my scores on that test down to a 9. And I was amazed. I felt so good. I remember waking up one morning and thinking, wow, is this how the rest of the world feels? Because it was the first time in my life that I could ever remember actually wanting to get out of bed and wanting to be part of the world. Not doing it because I was trying to prove something, but just because I wanted to.
Yeah. Wow. Oh my goodness. Okay. You have been through the ringer. Like this is just so much. So you,
and it gets better.
There's more to come. So, okay. So you go through all this, you have, now things are starting to feel a little bit better.
Yeah.
Now, between that point and your accident, how long was that?
That was 15 years between that and my accident.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So actually, I felt a lot better. I had some years that were pretty good. And I did deal with mild depression off and on, and I learned how to kind of manage it, but I was doing okay. And then in 2012, I was diagnosed with cancer. And that year was the beginning of the big one. Because I was diagnosed with cancer, and on the second, I was diagnosed with salivary gland cancer, and it was a very rare, highly aggressive form of cancer. And my doctor was just really pushing for me to do some treatments, or to start treatments immediately. And so I did get this treatment started, and on the second day of those treatments, my oldest son came to us and told us that he was gay. And that was really hard for me, having come from a father who was gay, who had actually died from AIDS when I was 21. And so the thought of having to watch my child go through things that I had watched my father go through was just heart-wrenching. I just couldn't imagine it. And so my son actually got into a counseling program for sex addicts, and it was something that was recommended to us by someone. And anyway, that's a whole nother story. But because my son was doing it, my husband decided that he was going to do it with him, just to support my son. And so at this point, I believed my husband's addiction was behind us, and my son was going to go through this, and my husband was going to go with him. And then I came to find out that my husband was still fully active in his addiction. And so that was that. And so we were dealing with all of this stuff, and it threw me back into a huge depression, and made me really angry, and also brought up a lot of PTSD from my childhood addiction. I think the combination of just all of these elements that were bringing up things from my childhood just really, threw me back. So I went through the cancer treatments, dealt with all of that. It took about 2 years for me to really feel better from the cancer and the cancer treatments, but I did beat it. And I've been cancer free for 4 years now, I think. So that's awesome.
That's awesome.
And so I actually, 2 years after I finished those treatments, I woke up one day and I felt really good. And I remember it because we got up and I said, our house had just gone to pot. We had just ignored everything for 2 years while we were dealing with all of this trauma. And so we got up and we planned all the things we were going to do to get our landscaping done, and our pool needed work and the inside needed work. And we were going to do all of this stuff. But our son was graduating 2 weeks later. And so we made all of these plans, but then we planned a trip, and we decided that for his graduation, we would take him and his younger sister, which our two youngest children were the only ones still at home at this time. And so we were going to take them to the dunes and go off-roading. It was something that my son had always wanted to do. So the next weekend we planned this trip, and we went to the dunes in southern Arizona. And we had been there for about 2 hours when my daughter and we were in a Polaris Razor, which is kind of a little dune buggy. And we were driving in that, and it flipped, and my right arm flew out of the cab of the vehicle and was crushed and severed. So that may have been the big one.
Let's agree that that's the big one. Let's agree that you have been through enough. Yes.
Well, it was interesting, though, because when this happened, I was really angry. And at that point, that was the point. It was the thing that finally snapped, that I was like, are you kidding me? Am I really being asked to go through another major trial? And this was my dominant hand. So, this was huge. It was connected I had one artery that survived and 4 tendons, and that was it. So it was off other than that. And I was told that they were going to amputate. And I was angry with God, because I felt like he was still testing me. And I was going, okay, how much do I have to prove?
Yeah.
So I went into surgery. I signed away everything to have my arm amputated, went into surgery, and I woke up the next morning and I still had a hand. And I remember waking up and being amazed and thinking that I actually had a hand, and in reality, I didn't. My surgeon told me later that all he had done at that point was clean it. But he said he got in there and he thought, you don't have anything to lose, obviously, because there was nothing there. And he had never tried to save anyone's hand that was as mangled as mine was. But he thought, you don't have anything to lose, and if we can save it, then why not? And so he cleaned it and aligned it and woke me up so that he could get permission to try and save it. And so we did decide to do that. But while I was in the hospital, I had an experience that was very profound to me. And I just felt this peace come over me. And I knew that everything was going to be okay. And I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know if that meant I was going to have a hand or not. But I felt like I was being given an opportunity at kind of a second chance of life, and that I could choose to continue on being the bitter and angry woman that I had been throughout my life, because I had been very bitter and angry through all of these trials, even though I kept trying to prove myself. But I could choose to keep doing that, or I could choose this peace that I felt, and I could use my experiences to go forward and help other people. And as I laid there in the hospital, I chose peace. And I have been choosing peace ever since, and it has completely changed my life. Um, it has become my mission, really, to share my experiences and to help other people understand that in spite of the trials and the difficulties of life, you can have peace and you can choose to be happy.
Yeah. So is that really, tell us more about your message and what has changed for you. So you felt peace and you've decided to choose peace, and how do you help others to follow that similar path?
Well, right. I actually had, I had the accident in May of 2014. And for the next probably 3 years, I spent a lot of time really working on myself, really trying to understand who I was, because I had been living my life really trying to prove something to God or to the world or to whoever, but I wasn't living for me. I was, doing everything for this other purpose that was going to give me peace. And I finally realized that, excuse me, I finally realized that the the peace that I was after was only going to come from within. And so I kind of changed the way that I thought. I started making the conscious decision to be joyful and to be happy and to deal with life in a positive way. And um, and I have to say that my life did not get easier. It took 20 surgeries to reattach my hand. And through that, I did some pretty crazy medical procedures on top of the surgeries in order to create the tissue that we needed to take care of it. And I had 4 staph infections and was in the hospital 5 different times. And I mean, it was just a long process. We also had to declare bankruptcy and lost our home. So life didn't get easy. The peace didn't come because the trials stopped. The peace really came because I chose it. And so in, what was it, a year? It was in February of last year. I had just had surgery and I was very drugged and I was laying in my living room by myself. It was the middle of the night. I couldn't sleep. And I picked up my computer and there was an advertisement for a life coaching school. I didn't even know what life coaching was, but by the time my husband woke up in the morning, I had signed up for it. Drugs are not a good thing. so, so I ended up going to school to become a life coach. And what I discovered in that program were the things that I had already taught myself. It was an interesting thing because I found the names for the tools that had changed my life. And it was a really powerful thing for me because I felt like I really was just led to that. And that has given me the tools to be able to help other people. And so now I am a life coach and I specialize in working with women who have a history of trauma or abuse, helping them to choose what they want from their lives and to be able to see that they do have control and they do have within them what it takes to have peace.
Yeah. Oh, and knowing all that you've been through, and we don't even know all of it, knowing what you've shared today of what you've been through, what a powerful place to come from when you work with another woman to be able to say, yes, you can get through this. I've been through this, and I know you can come through on the other side. And so I think that just adds this powerful perspective and puts you in such a position to be able to really help and impact lives.
It is really powerful work. I love it. It is the most rewarding thing that I have ever done.
That is so amazing. Um, I would just ask you, so first, tell us where people can find you and get more and read your book and all the good things that you put out there.
So my website is sandrajarviscoaching.com. And from there are links to where you can buy my book, which is available for pre-sale right now. It will be published officially on June 1st. And it is kind of my story and the things that I learned, which I barely touched on today. But there's just so much that changed in my life and that, has given me this passion for helping other people. I don't want people to have to be 45 years old when they finally discover that they can live a happy life in spite of the challenges of our world.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I love it. Would you just kind of leave us with this thought? How do you see things differently now than you did back when you were in the thick of all of it?
Oh, I think that I would say that, the big difference is that the big one. It's that I lived all of those years looking for an end of my trials. And what I've realized, because I'm looking for an end of those trials so that I could find the peace and so that I could be happy. And what I realized was that peace and happiness and joy is available amidst the trials. And that is really the difference in the way that I look at life. It's not that the trials have to end in order for us to have joy in our lives, but we can find joy within ourselves and apply that to any circumstance that we find ourselves in.
Oh, I love that so much, and made so much more powerful by hearing your story. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today.
Yes, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed talking to you today.
Yes, I have loved learning from you. Thank you for being here, and thank you everyone for listening to Moms Who Know. So I know you guys are amazed by Sandra's story like I was. One thing that I didn't ask her on the call and asked after is, did you get back a lot of the use of your hand? And she said she was able to regain through all her surgeries about 80% of the use of her hand. And she mentioned that she had taught violin lessons when her kids were younger. She is again able to play the violin. And so she said, that's the miracle. I should have shared that. But really, to me, that is one of the miracles. The other miracle is how she has come through on the other side and is stronger and is just finding peace amidst her trials. So the podcast discussion question for this week is, how do you find peace? What things do you do? What choices do you make? What attitudes do you have? How do you find peace? I would love to know the answer to that question. You can talk about it with a friend. You can think about that and ponder it. Or best of all is if you share it with me on Instagram at Moms Who Know Podcast or on Facebook at Moms Who Know Podcast. Just a quick note, if you go to the Moms Who Know Podcast page, there's a link to the group, and that's the best place to join the discussion. It's called Self-Care for Busy Moms by Moms Who Know Podcast. So join us there, and we'll see you next week on Moms Who Know.